most wanted man has finally been killed.
The United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda.
After a search that lasted more than a decade, triggered global wars, and cost the lives of tens of thousands of people.
USA! USA!
But will America's trophy kill,
Burn in hell, Osama bin Laden!
shatter, or reinforce the Al-Qaeda franchise? And what does it mean for Washington's wars in the Muslim world? This is Empire. Hello and welcome to Empire. I am Marwan Bishara. The United States has finally found and killed Osama bin Laden. With its leader, founder, and guru gone, what will become of Al-Qaeda, the organization, the ideology, and more importantly, the brand? By killing its arch-enemy in Pakistan, the US has also removed the main justification for its costly war in Afghanistan. So what is to become of its overall strategy in the Arab and Muslim worlds are just some of the questions I will discuss with my guests. Tariq Ali, historian, political activist, and author of The Obama Syndrome, Surrender at Home, War Abroad, among countless others. Fawaz Girgis, historian, director of the Middle East Center at the London School of Economics, and author of, most recently, Journey of the Jihadists, Inside Muslim Militancy. And last but not least, Vali Nasser, professor of international politics at Tufts University, former senior advisor to the Obama administration for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and author of Forces of Fortune, The Rise of the New Muslim Middle Class and What It Will Mean for Our World. But first, a recap of the long search for the elusive Osama bin Laden.
With the nation still reeling from the 9/11 attacks, it was only a matter of days before George Bush struck the tone that defined his foreign policy.
There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive."
That's because the White House was determined to overcome the impression that its reaction on the day itself was confused and uncertain. Even before the intelligence was in, the White House insisted Osama bin Laden was responsible. Yet almost immediately, the Bush administration began laying the groundwork for an approach that would go far beyond seeking retribution from just one man and his followers.
There are thousands of these terrorists in more than 60 countries. They are recruited from their own nations and neighborhoods and brought to camps in places like Afghanistan, where they are trained in the tactics of terror.
This set the stage to broaden the terms of conflict.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated.
George Bush made absolutely clear this policy was now set in stone, saying the most important thing is for us to find Osama bin Laden. It is our #1 priority. Until he changed his mind, saying, listen, our objective is more than bin Laden. 1 month later, the vice president took an entirely new approach. Bin Laden himself isn't that big a threat. Possibly because the Secretary of State had no idea where he was. I have seen nothing that suggests we know where he is, whether it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, or somewhere else. A few weeks later, the head of the CIA appeared to disagree with his boss, testifying that bin Laden remained an immediate and serious threat. Not so fast, replied the president. I truly am not that concerned about him. Thankfully, by the beginning of April, the most senior military officer in the nation finally cleared things up. George Bush's top priority was not, in fact, a priority at all. The goal has never been to get bin Laden. The confusion over what to do with this man was clearly apparent at the very highest levels of the White House. To understand why, one school of thought suggests it was more politically expedient for George Bush to allow bin Laden to remain at large. Osama on the loose helped justify the Bush-Cheney agenda. Another explanation is that within weeks of the attacks, the White House was already thinking about new theaters of war. They could either devote forces to hunting down bin Laden or lay the foundations to send them somewhere else. And by March 2003, we learned where, as the invasion of Iraq got underway.
They are still a threat. They are still dangerous. And that is why it is important that we succeed in Afghanistan and Iraq and anywhere else we find them.
Naturally, this philosophy had its political benefits as well. It had to, in order for the full breadth of this foreign policy vision to be seen through. Had Osama been captured early on, there's no guarantee the American people would have continued to support such an all-encompassing foreign policy, which is why the concept of the war on terror only shifted after George Bush left office. Once Barack Obama became president, his administration deliberately abandoned the phrase, the new president bringing with him a new rhetoric.
To the Muslim world, we seek a new way forward based on mutual interest and mutual respect.
And that new rhetoric, in turn, revealing a shift in approach. What has changed in American foreign policy is the rationale. Barack Obama said so himself.
Shortly after taking office, I directed Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA, to make the killing or capture of bin Laden the top priority of our war against Al-Qaeda.
Now that the American president has returned to specifics, he faces a new problem. If he's going to continue the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's up to him now to explain why.
Fawaz, why don't you start us off? So, Osama bin Laden was not just a leader, he was the founder, the guru of Al-Qaeda. With him gone, what does this really mean for Al-Qaeda?
Not much at all. It's an important psychological and symbolic development, but it does not really change the strategic landscape, either in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Iraq, in Yemen, and also in terms of what has been now called homegrown extremism or terrorism. Al-Qaeda as an organization is no longer a potent organization. At the height of its power, in the late 1990s, it numbered between 3,000 and 4,000 fighters. Now it's down to almost 200 fighters, basically on the run, being hunted by American forces in the Pakistan's tribal areas along the Afghanistan border. Most, 95%, actually more than 95, according to American intelligence community, the mid-level lieutenants, the managers who plot big operations have been eliminated. Al-Qaeda does not have the capacity to carry out large-scale, spectacular bombings along the 9/11 lines. In fact, despite its repeated threats since 9/11, it has not been able to carry out a single bombing inside the United States. As an organization, operationally, it's a crippled organization. But in fact, Al-Qaeda has not just suffered a major military setback. The greater setback has been in terms of loss of Muslim and Arab public opinion. That is, Al-Qaeda has lost Arab and Muslim hearts and mind. And the Arab revolutions, the so-called the Arab Spring in the last 6 months, has shown a huge divide between Al-Qaeda's ideology and the universal aspirations of millions of Arabs.
I think Fawaz is right on that account. I mean, aside from whether Al-Qaeda was operationally important anymore, it still was very important to the political narrative in the Middle East and in the Muslim world as a whole, and also in the way in which the West and the United States could engage the Muslim world. There was no closure to 9/11. He, in some ways, was sitting in the middle of the political debate internally and internationally. So I think it's now an opportunity. The combination of his death with the Arab Spring allows for a very different kind of political narrative. And even if there are remnants of Al-Qaeda and there might be terrorist attacks here and there, Al-Qaeda's ability to define the political discourse is now gone. And it's also much easier for politicians in America to imagine new ways of approaching the Middle East by ultimately arguing that they've taken care of business, quote unquote, and Al-Qaeda is not an issue that should preoccupy foreign policy.
But beyond Al-Qaeda, the organization, and bin Laden, the man, what about the brand, the ideology, the philosophy, the slogans, this way of reformulating jihad and global jihad directed against the so-called imperial powers, the Crusaders, and so on and so forth. You think that has lost currency?
To some extent. I mean, there's a difference between the brand and the ideology. I mean, some of the arguments that Al-Qaeda was able to appeal to the Muslim publics are still there, but now there might be much more competition from varieties of other sources to address.
Meaning such as what?
Such as either new thinkers are coming forward. Even on the domestic scene, the argument could be that the Arab Spring is addressing some of the arguments of that jihad is absolutely needed to bring down old political orders in the region. But the brand itself was very much based on him. I mean, the media, the international community, domestically, they made bin Laden into a larger-than-life icon. And it's almost like Che Guevara in the 1960s. Mm-hmm. And the fact that in the end he was not able to survive, and the manner in which he died clearly makes a dent in the brand. But the issues have not gone away. Clearly, a lot of the issues that Al-Qaeda claimed to be able to answer are still there, and they still have to be resolved.
So Tariq, he's a media construct, he's a media obsession, he's just a myth, or he's more than that, bin Laden?
No, I think he's more than that, but he became the symbol of this small group of terrorists, and the attack on Twin Towers and the Pentagon was a sensational act, sensational in media terms, sensational in historic terms, and that gave him this image. And of course, in the United States especially, they like to identify evil in one person. And that person became Osama bin Laden. And that now plays against them because they've now finally killed him in the way which state terrorism operates. Massive force, destroy him. Now what? The issues, as colleagues are saying, are there. Palestine continues to fester. Iraq is still occupied. Many Iraqis now are saying there's no reason for American troops to stay here. When are you going to get out? The war in Afghanistan goes on. Drone attacks continue in Pakistan without Osama. So these are questions now which have to be solved. And I think the point made earlier that the Arab world itself is changing and has changed in some countries is extremely important.
But you don't really take it seriously that this is sort of an evangelical thinking that progress is coming and that things will get better, and hence there will be no more of these periphery
I don't think that. The big problem, if you like, with Osama's ideology, there were many. You know, the mode of operation was wrong, completely isolationist. But he had no social program. If you read his essays and articles, which I've done, they're interesting, they're even well written. He attacks the despotisms in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, all that. But when you look to see what is your social program, what are you going to offer the Arab nation, the Arab people, there is nothing. Very little homilies.
Several points here. I want to just follow up on what my colleague said. The first point, I think one of the greatest misunderstandings of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda is that the fact we have taken the global jihad, transnational jihad, advanced by Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, for granted. And in fact, you cannot understand, it has always been a global jihad, a tiny fringe current, a tiny fringe historically in Arab and Muslim societies. Mm-hmm. You're absolutely correct. Osama bin Laden was an icon, a symbol of challenge for the United States of America. But you cannot underestimate also how the American war on terror elevated Osama bin Laden. Here you have the United States of America, the greatest military and political and economic power on the one hand, and Osama bin Laden. You can imagine what has happened.
But before that, Fawaz, but just on that point, so is it before the United States of America, the idea of what has happened on 9/11, the idea that modernity, popularization of technology, globalization can amplify thousands of times that event. The idea that Al-Qaeda then is not just a medieval organization, it's also a very modern group that uses image and so on and so forth to terrorize.
You're absolutely
Hence,
right.
even if they are fringe, but they could still have huge influence.
No one is denying this. But imagine, I mean, if you have dealt with Al-Qaeda and 9/11 differently, instead of declaring a global war against imagined and real enemies. That's what has happened. So think about it today, Marwan. On 9/11, on the morning after, the United States of America faced almost, and this is really the most generous account, 3,000 Al-Qaeda fighters, the global jihadists. Where are we today? If we are to, I mean, think of the wars that are raging now in Afghanistan. There was no Taliban in Pakistan. The resurgence of the Taliban in Afghanistan changes the entire strategic landscape. Iraq, there was, I mean, these are serious policy consequences of how the United States responded to Osama bin Laden. And also, while you're absolutely correct about the whole, I mean, impact of that particular iconic event, but what happened on the morning after helps us really to understand the context, where are we today, and the grave challenges facing international security.
Vali, do you accept the approach that Al-Qaeda Central, as we knew it, the whole idea of a band of militants in Afghanistan and Pakistan, has already spread through the region, maybe through the world, and this ideology, this brand that we're talking now, is now adopted by various groups, marginal groups, throughout, and whether they are coming out of London or various peripheries of various cities in the south or the north, but there are various bases now for Al-Qaeda.
Well, I think based on what was said, there are two separate issues. One is, as Tariq was saying, is you know, what is the content of Al-Qaeda's ideas and whether it has any further traction. Does it actually, this idea of self-perpetuating jihad declared even by non-clerics, and you know, going after, as Fawaz has written, whether on the far enemy or the near enemy, whether it still can be seen by Muslims as a solution to the political problems that they have on the table. That's one issue that I think is open to debate. We'll see how they react, especially given Arab Spring. The second issue is that bin Laden definitely proved, despite the numbers, that spectacular sensationalist acts can have a tremendous amount of disruptive capability, way out of the proportion of numbers. And there is some traction for this in the Arab world. I mean, after all, the most effective militaries in the Arab world are not owned by governments. There are these, as they call them, asymmetric non-state actors. It's the Hezbollahs, Hamas's, you know, it's the Taliban's.
But these are local in, right, in their goals
but
and
the goals is one thing, but you see, the idea is the tactics. I mean, in other words, there is value in terrorism as a military tool. Even governments are using it in terms of perpetuating policies across the border. That, I don't think necessarily we're done with that.
Please.
No, I think you're probably right on that. The question I was going to pose is that, you know, if you look at how this organization arose, we all know it, but it's worth repeating. They were radicalized in the global jihad led by the United States against the Russians in Afghanistan. That is when all these groups came to life.
But now everyone forgets that bin Laden used to be the archangel.
Everyone forgets
before he became the arch enemy.
Exactly. That all these people from Egypt, from Algeria, from Yemen came as fighters against the Russians.
And by the way, from New York and London.
There's plenty of Hollywood movies about you know, assets that you don't demobilize properly.
No, but I think that their time is now not the fact that there will never be small groups of people who will carry out armed struggle. That there will be unless these problems are solved. But this particular group and its ideology, I think, is weak. When I was in Yemen last year, I spoke to Iriani, the former Prime Minister of Yemen, and I said, tell me honestly, because there's a lot of stuff. Al-Qaeda of the Arab Peninsula is doing this. And I said, tell me honestly, Mr. Iriani, how many Al-Qaeda people are there in the Yemen? What's your estimate? You are close to the United States. You're the former Prime Minister of this country. He said, I said, 200? He said, at the maximum.
Between 50 and 300, yeah.
Yeah,
that's the
he said at the maximum. And when I went to the south of Yemen and talked to people, they came and whispered in my ear, I said, this is where Al-Qaeda is supposed to have attacked you. And one guy said, you want to know where Al-Qaeda is? They're based in the office next to the president. They use them constantly to get money.
So you don't think they count because of their small numbers in various places?
No, not numbers at all. In fact, this is really, I obviously did not make myself very clear. The numbers are really secondary. It's the ideology and it's basically the vision. Whether the global jihad vision has always had traction in the Arab world. No economic vision, no political vision, no vision for the future. But here I want to, again, bring some context.
But so, before we wrap up the first half, I want to read you a quote from Osama bin Laden.
Okay.
about Osama bin Laden from then candidate Obama to the Senate. At the time, he said, stressing the importance of taking on Al-Qaeda, he said, the more difficult task of understanding the sources of such madness, that the root causes of why the groups like Al-Qaeda could do what they do and why they could have such people are still and remain important.
You're absolutely correct. And again, as Tariq suggested, I don't think we should really overlook the possibility, the likelihood that some groups will basically re-emerge out of the rubble of the global jihad movement, and as long as the conditions are there. But I want to put some context. Few people remember that the global jihad movement or current emerged out of the rubble of the local jihad current, what we call insurgent groups, resistance groups against local dictators. I mean, long before Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah was born in the early 1980s. Al-Qaeda was born in the mid-1990s. It tells you a great deal how really current and recent this particular phenomenon is. I'm not suggesting that local insurgent groups, local resistance groups, like whether it's Hezbollah, Palestinian Hezbollah, or Palestinian Hamas, or Lebanese Hezbollah would disappear because the conditions are there.
Besides, they have nothing in common with Al-Qaeda.
Absolutely, this is the reality. But the question is, if we had contextualized the global jihad current on the morning after, if the United States and its leadership basically put Al-Qaeda in the right place. No one is suggesting Al-Qaeda was not dangerous, but instead of saying that Al-Qaeda is a security nuisance, Al-Qaeda was seen as part of an ideological framework that resonates throughout the Arab and Muslim world, and this was the intellectual misunderstanding that led us to the present.
And certainly the Arab Spring, in terms of mass popular mobilization for radical change in the Arab world and its relationship with the United States and the West, you think that will be the solution?
Well, I think it's important because combined with Osama's death, that you say that it has weakened the whole rhetoric, etc. The Arab Spring obviously suggests that there are other important political trends in the Arab world, that this is not only extremism and jihad versus authoritarian governments or versus the West, that there is other things happening, and there is obviously an opening. I mean, all of these issues that are on the table can be addressed alternately by different politicians in different ways. But I think the point that Fawaz made is important in the sense that, you could even say that ultimately many of these people in Al-Qaeda either may have been there for different reasons. They may not be even ideologically necessarily relevant to the larger arena. But the question is, what is the threshold of the West for a terrorist attack? I mean, if one person in Yemen can send a underwear bomber or a cartridge that brings down an airplane, and if that is seen as an absolutely intolerable act, then even if there are 10 people or 200 people, it's going to become an issue.
Fawaz, hold on to your thoughts, because we're going to come back and talk about specifically that and what does this all mean for the United States and Afghanistan and Pakistan. But we will do that after we come back from a news break. Welcome back with my guests, Tariq Ali, Fawaz Gerges, and Vali Nasser. Since he took office, President Obama has refocused U.S. strategic priorities on the war against Al-Qaeda, surged American troops in Afghanistan, and expanded the war to Pakistan. With bin Laden gone, but Obama's AfPak war going nowhere, Washington is left with more reasons to contemplate its next moves than to celebrate, especially as the Taliban prepare their next spring offensive and the Arab Spring heats up throughout the region.
By eliminating Osama bin Laden, the US has achieved its main policy goal. But the circumstances of his death might force Washington to review the entire policy itself. In Afghanistan, the Taliban is not in control and has no global ambitions, and American and coalition forces are no longer on the hunt for the Al-Qaeda leader. With no real Al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan, the objectives of the war have been met. So will these troops be removed? Unfortunately for Washington, all the attention is now shifting to Pakistan. And this is where it gets complicated. Late last year, the White House approved a new multi-billion-dollar deal in military aid to Pakistan, on top of many billions more already pledged in trade and industry. But by finding bin Laden where they did, the Americans feel betrayed. Publicly, all diplomatic statements emphasize cooperation.
This is a good and historic day for both of our nations. And going forward, it is essential that Pakistan continue to join us in the fight against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates.
Privately, however, that hasn't been the case for some time. Unmanned drone attacks have been operating for years, despite Pakistani reservations or outright objections. And the mission to kill bin Laden was deliberately carried out without the Pakistanis knowing anything about it. Now, it's likely to get worse. Pakistan is no Afghanistan, and the United States cannot afford to start yet another war. But with its forces just across Pakistan's border, this could get more complicated very quickly.
Very Nasser, now we know more than ever that there isn't much of an Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, not of recently anyway. So why America wouldn't seriously consider withdrawing now from Afghanistan?
Well, it potentially could. Already it has committed to the idea that it would support a political settlement between the warring factions that would have the support of the region. The question is, how would you go about that? Obviously, there is now, particularly given that it's a budget crisis that you have in the West, in England, in the United States, there's much more of an interest to essentially have a point to declare victory and leave. I mean, Osama bin Laden's death definitely provides that point. Now, the question is that you have to come up with a diplomatic strategy that would you could work your way to finish this war. And I think the Afghan government, the Taliban, the Pakistanis, they all also are pretty much concluding that two things are going to drive us. One is bin Laden's death. The other one is Arab Spring, because it's actually proving to be far more costly and demanding in form of resources that anybody anticipated, and it may go on for a number of years. And the Taliban may also have an easier time basically saying, well, he's dead, Al-Qaeda is pretty much gone. So, the demands that you had on us about having to break relations with them probably are not as important as they were yesterday, and you probably will attest to that. So I think it's an opening. It has to be exploited.
Tariq, it seems to me that we keep speaking about the Arab Spring in the Arab world, but spring in Afghanistan means spring offensive. Taliban, in fact, are preparing for their spring offensive. So probably expect a heated summer.
Yeah. I think there is no doubt that the American war in Afghanistan has now reached a critical stage. They have not been able to wipe out the Taliban. All the areas which they take, they have to withdraw from. They know that this war is not going well. Behind the scenes, they're negotiating with the Taliban. They've made offers to the Taliban to join a coalition government. The Taliban has said, we will happy to consider that, but after all, foreign troops have left. So this business has been going on now for 5 or 6 years, even when bin Laden was alive. They could now accelerate that procedure and say there has to be a national coalition government and get the local powers involved. And these local powers, I would say, are Russia, Iran, Pakistan, and China. China, crucially, it's on the border, it's got a lot of money. Pakistan for obvious reasons, Iran for obvious reasons, and Russia for obvious reasons. And these 4 countries, I think, should be given the responsibility for setting up a national coalition government and asking the United States and the NATO forces to leave.
So national coalition government that would include the Taliban?
Of course.
And I suppose, Fawaz, that the window of opportunity you were just talking about earlier, in the sense that there is no longer commitment towards anyone, because Taliban's commitment was to bin Laden, the person, and they actually don't have any love lost for Al-Qaeda.
Absolutely. Now we have between 20 and 50 Al-Qaeda operatives, according to the CIA. That is down to 20.
Fought by 100,000 soldiers, by the way, just to remind our viewers around the world.
So you have on 27, approximately, depending on estimate, 27,000 Taliban fighters, between 27 and 17,000. The estimate now is that Al-Qaeda is down to 20 or 25 or 50 operatives in Afghanistan. I think the big point here is that President Obama has bought the terrorism narrative. That is, you cannot understand why the United States is deeply embroiled in Afghanistan, shifting sands, without understanding the fact that the United States lumps the Taliban, a regressive social movement, a huge regressive, of course, it's not progressive, with Al-Qaeda itself. The reality is...
But presumably they're divided between the counter-terrorism and the counter-insurgency.
No,
and the bin Laden, and
There are
And the Bidens of the world are more
there are
counterterrorism.
multiple perspectives within the American. We know this, but the reality is the surge in Afghanistan tells you a great deal.
That they want both counterterrorism and counterinsurgency.
In the 1990s, you talked about Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Almost 10 years after 9/11, the United States of America has never accused the Taliban in Afghanistan of plotting or carrying out a single global jihadist operation against America. Never, not even point one. In the late 1990s, the Shura Council of the Taliban, based on documents that we all have seen, captured by America, the Taliban, the Shura Council of the Taliban decided to either kill Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, and expel him from Afghanistan. Even in the late 1990s, the dominant wing within the Taliban, a majority, believed that the Al-Qaeda was doing a great deal of harm to the Islamic Emirat. It was Mullah Omar himself who basically vetoed the decision by the Shura Council. The reality is, and that's why the exit of Osama bin Laden, and I agree with Vali on this point, might hopefully provide closure to this particular terrorism narrative and allow President Obama to take a second look at the Afghan theater.
Well, I mean, the second look would have to come, and at some point, whenever you end up in these things, whether it's Maoist in Nepal or Hezbollah in Lebanon, there's always going to be debate about laying down arms first, and that's between Afghans. I'm not talking about the outsiders, and there's always this issue of fighting and talking. The Taliban want to fight their way to the table, to come with a strong hand vis-a-vis Karzai. The Americans also want to fight their way to the table to have a better bargaining position. But the reality is that the Taliban know they cannot win Kabul, just as much as you say the international forces may realize that they cannot win. And now with bin Laden out of the way, that might be good. But there's also another consideration. It's not just the actual Al-Qaeda numbers. There are two particular groups that are worrisome to the outside. One is the Haqqani network, which has been very close with at least the Al-Qaeda elements, both within Pakistan and the outside. And the other is the Lashkar-e-Taiba. And that the worry there is that is when the Mumbai issue happened, they had operatives in the US, they collect money in the UK, and they also have showed up in Afghanistan periodically. So there is there is going to be some degree of wanting to make sure that these guys don't come in. The Arabs are gone. But this thing we talked about earlier, the utility of terrorism, the fact that you might be able to say there are elements of Taliban that are just tribal leaders.
But do you think that would require a military solution?
It requires that the military solution is to get you to the table now. But when you get at the table, you have to have a deal that is going to hold.
I mean, for the Haqqani group, you think they will have to be dealt with militarily?
They are being dealt with militarily, both on the north side of the border, and now there's a lot of, when we say that the Pakistanis ought to go into North Waziristan, basically our argument is that they also have to put pressure on the Haqqanis. But the Haqqanis are actually very hardened fighters. Going back to the Afghanistan period, they're not your tribal commanders. But these are the sort of things that have to get sorted out.
Well, I mean, look, you have to see that within Pakistan, the military has been, since they were asked to abandon the Taliban, their only victory they have ever won, the Pakistani army, was to take Kabul with the Taliban. They were asked to unwind that, dismantle. They did it, but it created enormous tensions inside this army. The Lashkar-e-Taiba and all these groups were set up by the ISI. They know who they are, they know what the personnel is, they know how they function, but they let them go. And the reason they keep them going is because they know that the war in Afghanistan will have to come to an end sooner or later. The West can't stay there, and then they will be the dominant power in the region, which is why I'm saying it's much better to involve Russia and Iran as well and not allow the Pakistani to do it on their own.
Tariq, let's stick to this question of Pakistan now. So what worries you more? The fact that when they killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, that the Pakistanis didn't know about it, or that they could have probably knew about it?
Look, I have been arguing for some time. In fact, I wrote it in 2006, according to my sources, that Osama was in Pakistan. probably in a safe house, and probably protected by the intelligence agencies. Now we see that this safe house was just next to the Pakistani military academy, near a military town, Abbottabad, where lots of officers live. I will not believe that the Pakistani intelligence or top layers within did not know. It's incredible and unbelievable. Whether they knew this attack was coming, we are not 100% sure.
So that is far worse than if they didn't know.
But you see, the thing is that
that means they're complicit.
Yeah, of course. But look, the other thing is this, that if they knew he was there and actually leaked the news, they're not going to announce it to us, and nor the Americans. But if you look at the WikiLeaks, the deal between the Pakistani government and the US, you can use your drones, but please, we have to say we didn't know and even denounce you. So please accept that. And the Americans said, we'll accept it.
Sounds like the Yemenis.
Yeah. But you know, if you look at it, the point is not whether the Pakistanis necessarily knew where he was. The point is that when the Americans began to zero in on where he was, they decided they cannot afford to let Pakistan know. So if you're the American decision makers, and we're talking about winding down this war, you're sitting on this side of the border, regardless of why you got there, you're saying that on that side of the border, whether it's the Haqqanis, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and Osama bin Laden, are all basically, you know, protected by the same establishment. So the question is, you know, you cannot finish the Afghan war without having some kind of a guarantee that that's not going to come back north of the border.
And this brings me to, I mean, I think we were talking about Afghanistan. The real war is being waged in Pakistan, not in Afghanistan, as you well know. Again, more than 85% of America's drone attacks are taking place in Pakistan. Al-Ashkar-al-Taiba and others. The question on the table is, does America's military engagement really produce a better conditions on the ground to bring about a settlement, or does
Afghanistan
and Pakistan, the radicalization, Marwan, and probably you know, both my colleagues know more about Pakistan, the radicalization of the middle class, in particular the military. Most of my colleagues in Pakistan tell me that this is an extremely worrying sign.
Because of the drone attacks and the so-called collateral damage.
In the last 2 years, every single homegrown plot and attack, basically we can trace it to the Afghanistan-Pakistan war.
Exactly.
Most of the interrogation, the transcripts we have, most of the suspects say they have been radicalized by America's war. In particular, Iraq used to be, from 2004 to 2008, the major cause of homegrown.
So we are watching for us then a repeat of the same mistakes of the past in that region that led to the rise of Al-Qaeda.
And I want to come back to the big point, is that about President Obama, and the reality is, to a great, despite his rosy rhetoric, despite this visionary, intelligent, brilliant president, that is, he is himself hostage of a particular narrative on Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I'm not suggesting that there are not threats in Pakistan, but the threats, I mean, think about how the threats have been exacerbated because of this particular global war.
Vali and Tariq, please take us to the next stage. And I have a huge problem with this whole AFPAC strategy from one strategic sense, is that historically, Afghanistan has always been the periphery to Pakistan. But for some reason, for the last 2 years, the Obama administration has been treating Pakistan as if it is the periphery of Afghanistan, when it is few times greater, bigger, a nuclear power, and far more complicated than Afghanistan. And yet, it's been treated as a periphery, and hence, now it is becoming the collateral damage of the war.
It always happens in imperial wars when sometimes they can't win them, they blame all of it on a neighboring country. The Vietnam War, they said Cambodia was the problem, they went and destroyed that. It didn't do anything in the long run. Now in Pakistan, you have on both sides of the border Pashtun tribes, many of them linked to each other historically, many of them intermarrying. You can have a border with villages on either side, and this is a border which goes for thousands of kilometers. Impossible for anyone to control this border. That's one thing. The Pakistani military actually have gone out of their way to help the Americans by creating 1 million refugees, cleaning some parts of the border. So you have internal refugees in Pakistan today. The situation is a mess. Then you have a social and economic crisis in Pakistan, because we have one of the most corrupt governments in the region, which does nothing for the ordinary people. On top of that, you have drone attacks. So are we surprised that people are getting angry. What surprises me is that more people are not going in this direction.
It really is.
That really surprises me.
It really is. A
which is
surprise.
a good thing, and which shows that Pakistanis in general are not sympathetic to religious extremism, but push them, and who knows what will happen.
In fact, elected a number of secular.
Absolutely. In every
election, the religious extremists have got less than 10% of the vote.
Which tells you a great deal about the weight of social forces.
Yeah. Riley, you wanted to jump in.
Well, you know, a military campaign has its own logic. In other words, for whatever reason, once you have troops on the ground in Afghanistan, but not in Pakistan, there are going to be more dollars going to Afghanistan than is going to Pakistan. I mean, the reality is that for every dollar of assistance that goes to Pakistan, $30 goes to Afghanistan. And that's because there is actual troops on the ground. That's the way the Congress works. That's the way this mentality works. Now, you know, the issue of drones is obviously an important issue in the sense of what, particularly politically, it's a sensitive issue in
2,000 civilians have died.
Well, the numbers of civilians is what the Pakistani military has pretty much put out in the public. But the reality is that it has had a lot to do with downgrading Al-Qaeda, for instance. When we give these numbers, and you know, in Iraq was the same. You know, there was these campaigns that special forces did. It was probably even more important in disrupting, dismantling, you know, going after them, not giving them space, etc.
But Al-Qaeda more than Iraq. No, the Americans occupied it.
Well, but I mean, you know, when you look at, you know, when you gave a commander at some point, doesn't matter why you got here. Your job is to.
Actually, in Iraq, the special operation forces targeted the various resistance groups, the secular and the Ba'athist resistance groups. It was really the Iraqis themselves that did a great deal of damage to Al-Qaeda when the shift took place in Iraq itself.
Do you think they kill more than they groom new recruits?
That is the question.
That's what the big question.
Well, there is obviously public, what do you call it, spin on this on both sides. But you know, the logic of this.
What's your spin?
No, the spin is that I think it's difficult to tell. There is a lot more anger in urban cities of Pakistan than where actually the drones are hitting. I mean, journalists who sometimes go into Fatah, they say because much like Iraqis, they hate Al-Qaeda.
Some of them.
They dislike Al-Qaeda. They're actually not as. But you know, when you go to Lahore or Karachi, that's not where the drones are going. There's a lot more anger because they see it as a violation of their borders and sovereignty. They don't see it as a whether this is an efficient.
We had this episode with Raymond Davis killing 2 Pakistanis in the streets in Lahore.
No, this is
private security drones. It's a presence of American special forces now all over Pakistan, in every city.
Well, you know, the problem is that you have 2 countries who supposedly are allied in a war on terror, but they don't necessarily trust
in Pakistan and the
United States. And also you have a complicated issue of you know, the terrorist groups, guerrilla groups, etc. Which you know, even the relationship with Pakistan is not as simple as the relationship of, say, Al-Qaeda forces to Jordanian government or to the Egyptian government. It was very clear boundary where it stood.
Let's on this note, and going back to what you said earlier, Tariq, because it seems to me unless this thing is regionalized, there's going to be no particular solution, not with drones and not with occupying forces. I have a feeling this needs to start by respecting people's maybe minds and sentiments as people, as states. And maybe starting with the mutual respect, the so-called, that President Obama talked about with Pakistan. That there is a national interest for Pakistan in Afghanistan, and that there is an Indian-Pakistani conflict going on within the region, and there is a serious effort needs to be done for the region or towards the region.
As far as India-Pakistan is concerned, that's a big issue. But that can only happen by both these paths. I mean, India is not a small state. It's a huge state now and a growing state.
A regional power, a global power.
Exactly. If the Indians, I've been arguing, have to take an initiative, not just with Pakistan, but all the smaller states in the region. And I think what would work there would be some style of union not which challenges the sovereignty of each country, but which opens borders, carries out trade, disarmament. That is what needs to be done. But it sounds utopian at the moment because it is caught up in two issues. One, Afghanistan, and the Indians are present there too in different ways, and second, Kashmir. These issues have to be sorted out. They haven't been sorted out. The West has basically not shown any interest in Kashmir at all. But at the moment, Afghanistan is critically important. I think unless there's an exit strategy to pull out from Afghanistan, whether Osama's dead or alive is going to have nil impact at all. They have to decide to change what has been going on in Afghanistan, pull back, get out, try and create something creative, and then maybe we can see some movement.
For us, either has to be an escalation or it has to be a withdrawal of some sort.
Well, here it's called IMPA. The program here is called IMPA.
Yes.
And I think your question goes to the very heart of how IMPAs really act and behave. And that's unfortunately at this particular moment in history. The United States is really acting like old IMPAs in Afghanistan and Pakistan, relying more on military might as opposed to different strategy. From everything we know, and this is really, I mean, just fundamental, Pakistan will not collaborate, will not cooperate in Afghanistan unless its strategic, geostrategic interests are taken into account. That is, its backdoor, that is Afghanistan and its Kashmir. Final point, we talked about the United States seizing power, seizing the moment in the Arab world after the I hope that the exit of Osama bin Laden, the United States would seize the moment in the Pakistan, Afghanistan, Indian theater and try to find a geostrategic settlement in the region.
Very Nasser, yes or no? You think Washington is ready for that kind of a deal in Afghanistan, Pakistan?
The deal has always been, I mean, the Secretary of State has said it in that you know, the United States will support the political settlement between the Afghan
Is it serious?
Well, of course it's serious, but you know, the political deals, as we know, that end conflicts can take a long while.
Tariq Fawaz and Valley, we're going to have to wrap it up. And I will be back with the final thoughts. Two events have dominated the world's news agenda over the last few days. While terribly different, both stories were covered with the same fanfare. The first is a fairy tale of healing, happiness, and love that transcends class and generational gaps. The latter portrayed as a drama thriller of search for justice and victory against hatred that transcends borders and religions. But if the royal wedding was an occasion when the international media felt entitled to take time out from journalism, it seemed to abandon journalism altogether with its hyper coverage of the US killing of Osama bin Laden. The emphasis on good vanquishing evil, light against darkness, and heroism against all odds lacked objectivity, context, history, and nuance. Media executives must have been thankful that President Obama ordered the operation to take place after the wedding, because I wonder what their priority would have been otherwise. Well, that's the way it goes. Write to us with your suggestions and visit our website. Until the next time.